Hello everybody, JGC Animate here. Today we are going to be reviewing JoJo Part 3. This part is quite interesting since unlike the last two parts where I only had to get through a few episodes, like season 1 or part 1 was like 9 episodes and part 2 was 17. This one was 48 episodes. Quite the drastic difference. Probably one of the longest JoJo parts I've had to sit through. And I don't have like massive thoughts on it, but I am here to share my few thoughts. So yeah, let's just hop right into this. So what is a story summary of JoJo Part 3? Basically, kind of like Part 2, it takes place after the second generations of JoJo, where now we're focusing on Joseph Joestar's grandson, Jotaro. And after some events leading towards Jotaro's mom being cursed by something, it's hard to remember. That was so long ago when I started watching this. But she was cursed by something that involves the return of the character Dio, who returned from Part 1. And now Jotaro, along with Joseph, who Joseph is in this, so I'm very happy about that. Other characters such as Avdol, Kakyoin, Iggy, and well, Iggy comes in later, and Polnareff, or I hope to say that right, like Polnareff. His name is very hard to pronounce. Basically, they all go on a trip towards the place of Egypt. They go to Egypt to try to stop Dio and save Jotaro's mom, also known as Joseph's daughter. So yeah, that's kind of the somewhat premise. I'm not very good at it since a lot happens in this part, so trying to wrap it all up quickly is going to be quite difficult, so I'm not going to try. But yeah, let's just get right into this. So what are some things I liked and disliked? One thing I could say is that while I didn't really hate anything of this part, one thing I definitely disliked was the lack of development for certain characters. Like, there is one character who I could talk about in the spoiler section who gets a ton, and I mean a ton, of development in the story. And everyone else is just kind of put on the sidelines. And it makes it a bit awkward considering that each of them has specific episodes dedicated towards their character, but only one of them actually has like some massive development. Some of the other ones kind of have little bits of development, but they're not like life-changing developments. They're just like, oh, well, I guess this character can grow a little bit. And that's a little bit frustrating because honestly, I thought with having this big of a crew, it was just going to be so much fun seeing how they interacted. But even though they interact a lot with one another, it's quite rare that a certain amount of characters get much attention. Like Joseph is in this part, who I loved Joseph in Part 2. So that's probably still stands as my favorite part of JoJo as of where I'm watching right now, aka just finishing Part 3. But Joseph doesn't really have that many episodes about him. I think he only has like 2 adventures in the entirety of JoJo, but like in Part 3, I'm pretty sure he only has like 2 or maybe 3 adventures involving him as a character, as a like plot relevant character. And for some people, it's even less. And that's what makes it kind of frustrating because despite having such a massive cast, none of them really have a specific like development stage where every single character gets development. I like stories where they introduce characters and try to develop all of them if they're going to bother bringing in so many. But maybe that's just me. Something I actually really did like though, where it was actually the idea of the return of Dio. While I'm not too sure how I feel about his actual return in this part, I thought the idea was pretty interesting, even if it didn't really make much sense considering the previous parts kind of contradicted it. But I'm assuming the writer probably just didn't know what he was writing at the time, since there's a few plot holes here and there. But we can move past those because the story itself was somewhat interesting. Granted, I wasn't a humongous fan of the villain of the week, but eventually that kind of changed around, where around the second half, like the last 24 episodes, all focused on like new villains every single episode, where not every single episode, but like every other episode. Usually each of the villains would get 2 episodes, and there were even some reoccurring villains, which I really liked. And honestly, one thing that I definitely have to say I mostly dislike about this whole part was definitely like the huge amount of animal abuse type stuff in it, because there's a lot of animal gore in this part, which I can definitely say I dislike. But I know I sound like I'm mostly disliking things, but there's a lot of great stuff I enjoy too. Like, once again, Joestar is back, and he's just as entertaining as he was before. Sadly, he's not around as much, so we don't really get to see much of his greatness. But I would like to talk about Jotaro later in the spoiler section. But the other characters, Kakyoin, Polnareff, Iggy, and Avdol, they're fine. They're actually pretty good. I like them as characters, and I honestly really enjoyed seeing them in this show. I can't really talk too much about the villains or the side characters because, well, with them being somewhat just monsters of the week or people who are very rarely relevant, I don't really see the point in, like, talking about things that, you know, aren't really important. But I can talk about some characters that I actually really enjoyed, which I'll get into again in the spoiler section, which we should probably hop into right now. So here is a timestamp to when the spoiler section of this video will come to its conclusion. So yeah, I'm gonna count down from 5 and hop right into the spoiler section. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Okay, so there is this one massive issue that I have to talk about, and that's how little the character Jotaro Kujo does in this part. Like, he does almost nothing. He mostly just stands around looking all cool and badass. He's just standing around there just looking cool. I get that was kind of meant to be his character, but it honestly kind of annoyed me because he does maybe like 8, 9 cool things, and half of those cool things are mostly stories focused on other characters, and he just happens to come in at the end and just brings out his, like, stand, which stands are a thing in this. I honestly am not a big fan of them. Even after watching 48 episodes of stands, I still don't think I like them that much. They're not terrible, but they also get very confusing. It's kind of frustrating with Jotaro how little he actually does besides just being like a cool person, where his stand just shows up and just goes like, and it's just the whole point of the stand is it's literally just there to be cool, because apparently it's so powerful. He basically just doesn't have anything to do. He can't really have too many developments, and he mostly just kind of stands around. Like, he's there, but he doesn't do that much. Like, as I mentioned before, he does maybe like 8 to 10 cool things throughout the entire 48 episode run. And the thing that surprised me the most was that they called him the main character, when, from what I've seen, the main character of this series is basically Polnareff. I think I said his name right. He's more of a main character than Jotaro is in this part, because he has so many episodes, so many stories dedicated to his character, that I am astounded for them to say Jotaro is the main character, because Polnareff, he is literally the main character. I don't care what anyone says, he is so much the main character in this season of JoJo. You cannot tell me otherwise, because he has so many episodes dedicated to his character. Kakyoin has like maybe 1, 2 episodes. Iggy has like a 2-parter. Avdol, I don't even know if Avdol has a story dedicated to him. But Polnareff has so many stories dedicated to his and his character alone. Like, he goes through so many story arcs that I am surprised for people to say Jotaro is the main character when he does literally almost absolutely nothing. And that's not to hate on Jotaro. I think he's a cool character. Is he better than Joseph? No. But he is still a cool character, and I still respect him as a character. But even though I didn't like Polnareff for a majority of the first part of JoJo's Part 3, like the first 24 episodes, he really grew on me throughout that. And by the end, when he was the only one to survive with Avdol and Kakyoin both dying, as well as Iggy dying, with only him, Jotaro, and Joseph surviving, I actually wanted to follow Polnareff at the end of the story. I was just like, can we follow him? I want to see his adventures. Please, I'd like to see where he goes. It just kind of shows that he had way more development than Jotaro ever did, and honestly, it was so disappointing that someone like him, who clearly stole the spotlight, was kind of just treated as if he wasn't the main character, because to me, he was the main character, and I respected the heck out of him for it. Another thing I have to kind of bring up is the villain of the week, because honestly, the villains of the week weren't terrible. I just felt like a majority of them were very, very forgettable. There were a few that I can easily remember without any issue. However, there are some that just don't stand out. There are some that definitely do because, you know, they're reoccurring characters, like the character Whole Horse, who's quite literally probably one of my favorite villains throughout the whole series. Like, he was so much fun to watch that I just couldn't get enough of him. And the time when he teamed up with the character, I think his name is Boingo, I loved it. And it's so weird because it feels to me like anytime JoJo actually moved away from the heroes, because there were like 2 episodes or something like that or at least 2 storylines, where we focused on the villains instead. And I loved them. They were so much fun. Just, even though some of the villains, like the villain of the weeks, were very easily forgettable, there were also ones that I just loved so much. Because just, even though I didn't love every part of it, I think some of the villains in this part were unforgettable. Sadly, the same cannot be said for Dio. I like Dio. I thought he was a really cool villain in part 1. I didn't love him, but I liked him. However, he was just kind of disappointing in this part, because he doesn't even appear until like the last 4 or so episodes, and he gets beaten by Joestar. What I thought was going to happen was they were going to meet Dio at like 24 episodes in, and they lose to him miserably, and that's when Joestar starts to train and learn that he can't just be a cool, like, awesome, badass person. But then, no, we don't even run to Dio to the last 4 episodes, where Jotaro does exactly that. He just somehow knows that his stand can do what Dio's stand can do, and that is freeze time. And I just felt like the whole thing with Jotaro, he was literally just, what would you kind of call it? Plot convenience, I guess you could say. Like, Jotaro somehow always knew what to do. He could always handle any situation. He could somehow do everything. Like the episode with one villain who could turn people into kids, where guess who was the main focus of most of that episode? Polnareff. What happens at the very end? Jotaro comes in, and then even after he's kind of weakened, he's still somehow super cool, able to easily do it because why not? Like, one of the biggest flaws with Jotaro is how few weaknesses he has. I feel like there wasn't anything to push him and strive for more. That might change in future parts that I haven't seen yet, but I really did not like how Jotaro kind of easily swept through everything. I wanted him to struggle and see how far he could come, but unlike everyone else who did struggle, he almost never struggled at all. And the fact that it was him who beat Dio, instead of something like maybe Joseph's outsmarting, or maybe some wise words from the ghost of Jonathan or something like that, it was just like, yo, no, Dio can stop time, I can too, ha! And it's just, the way they defeated Dio was a little bit unsatisfying, and I'm not afraid to admit that. It was so unsatisfying the way Dio went out. It was good at the same time, and I was still happy, like, yeah, finally, Dio's gone, but it was less clapping out of excitement, like, woo, and it was more clapping of, okay, finally, we can move past this now, because, as I mentioned before, this is a 48 episode season, and it shows just how much happens despite the fact how little really matters to the plot. Most of it is just random stuff, and most of those villains don't even really come into play later. Some of them are cool, but overall, I definitely found myself not really caring by the end. When they finally defeated Dio, I was less clapping because they finally did it, and more because that meant the part could finally be over. Although I did like the ending part where Joseph pretends that Dio possessed him, which was really, really funny. And then Jotaro actually looked like he was gonna try to kill his grandpa, but yeah, that was still funny, but this part just didn't really stick with me. Like, it's not a terrible part, but I had more dislikes than I did likes after sitting through all of this. Overall, I just hope in the future Jotaro gets more character development and gets more fleshed out in future parts, since I know he's gonna be around in those parts, but I don't know. I haven't started part 4 yet, so I can't be for sure. And yeah, There are a few other things I could go over, but the two major things I did want to talk about were Polnareff and Jotaro. The only things I could really talk about more is how I kind of wished Avdol got more attention in the anime. He didn't get the attention he deserved. He was like barely in it in terms of story. He was there, but he didn't do more than maybe like free Polnareff back when they first met after being after he was mind controlled by Dio. But other than that, Avdol doesn't do much. He's mostly just there. And I'm cool with that, but honestly, I wish Avdol got more attention. The only thing I can really give this part in its hilarity is probably the very awkward moments, like the one with Joseph and Avdol with a magnet lady and a bunch of other stuff that was honestly funny, but overall kind of pointless. But yeah, this part didn't stick with me too well. It's not a terrible part, but I definitely have to say it was not one of my favorite parts. It was better than part 1, I'll give it that, but to be fair, that's not much of an accomplishment. But yeah, this wasn't terrible, but all in all, I didn't really like it that much. It was fine at best, and honestly, I wish it could have been more entertaining. Again, it wasn't terrible, but it was a long haul, and by the end, I was just glad to have been done, and I really hope this kind of stuff isn't like gonna be a pacing issue in future parts, because it definitely was hard to sit through it all. But yeah, I still think it was a very strong overall story. There were so many things, from Jotaro not doing much other than like the really important stuff, to Joseph not getting enough screen time. I know he shouldn't be because it's not his part, but dang, I love those Joseph episodes. And I also wish that some other characters got a little more spotlight, like Avdol or also Kakuin, since some of them actually had some pretty interesting stories. And honestly, I also really enjoyed the Iggy special episode where he went against the character, I believe, a bird named Pet Shop. That was a great two-parter and definitely made me respect Iggy a lot more. Although, one thing I will just throw in right now, I'll be honest. I was not expecting Avdol, Kakuin's, and Iggy's death. Well, I was expecting Kakuin because it was spoiled, but Iggy and Avdol, I was not expecting their deaths. That's just one last thing I was trying to throw in there. That actually caught me by surprise when it said they were dead, and I was just astounded and thinking, wow, they actually did that. Wow. But yeah, other than that, I didn't love it, but I didn't hate it. So yeah. We're at the conclusion of this video, and what are my final thoughts? It's fine. It was better than part 1, but if I had to say, it wasn't as great as part 2. It went on for way too long. It really dragged itself, and honestly, I wish that it could have been a little more well-paced in terms of like how it controlled every story. Granted, it was still very well paced, but I still found myself not loving it. Overall though, I didn't hate it, and I still enjoyed myself a fair amount, and that's why I have to give part 3 of JoJo's Bizarre Adventure a 7 out of 10. That's all from me, and I'll see you all around. Peace!